Hello, and welcome to our lecture on the diffusion of urban life. We're going to talk specifically about Greece and Rome. The slides were designed to accompany the book People, Places, and Culture, and I am, of course, Miss Gall, and I'll be your host for the lecture. So, before we kind of start off talking about Greece and Rome, I do want to tell you that while this information is nice to know, and it probably is a little nice to know for your retake and things like that, it's very unlikely that you're going to find this information on the AP exam in May. So you might find generalized information about the diffusion of cities and where cities start, but I'd be surprised if you found a lot about Greece and Rome. That being said, again, it's kind of nice background information to know, just to have in the back of your brain when you're thinking about processes and things like that. So, let me go ahead and get started here. We talk about Greek cities, right? Greece is often described as a secondary hearth of urbanization, partially because if you've listened to some of the prior lectures, then you know that it's not one of those places where urbanization actually gets its start, but the trick with the Greek city system is that it spreads throughout the world centuries later using basically European colonialism, right? So we talk about Greek cities. There's a handful of things you should know, right? First of all, every city had an acropolis, which is basically like a hill on which there was usually a temple to whatever god happened to be the patron of the city, right? And it's where people, and those temples are really the most impressive structures that we talk about when we talk about ancient Greek cities. And then there was an Agora, which is the marketplace, becomes the focus of commercial activity, ultimately of political activity and things like that. And then urbanization, as you and I know it, starts in Greece and then spreads to the Roman Empire when Rome takes over Greece and incorporates it into the empire. So the picture we've got here is actually a picture of the Acropolis, probably in Athens, if I had to guess, which is a great big tourist site. Very beautiful from what I've heard. But we're going to go ahead and move on. We're going to talk about a little bit about Roman cities. Okay, so when Romans succeed the Greeks, when they take over the Greeks, and they take over the Etruscans, and the Etruscans actually were in northern Italy. Okay, so if you remember your geography, okay, the Rome is kind of towards the middle of Italy. The Etruscans are to the north, and then the Greeks, if I remember correctly, are a little bit to the east. So the Roman Empire actually literally goes not just Italy, but also ultimately at its largest, a huge part of the interior of Europe. Think all the way over into Germany. Okay, think all the way out to Britain. And literally down into that whole northern coast of Africa. Okay. So, a few quick reminders, right? Sites of cities are their absolute location, right? Generally speaking, they're chosen for the advantages in trade or defense, or as a center for religious practice. So an advantage for trade, for example, might be a city that's got really good transportation routes. So it would be, for instance, to locate it on the ocean. Pardon me. When we're talking about defense, that's where you get kind of that stereotype of the city on the hill that's looking down, right? Or that's got maybe water on 3 out of the 4 sides, right? Makes it harder to attack. Religious practice is a little bit trickier, but remember, in Greece and again, especially in early Rome, religion is very closely tied to place, and so specific sites will have religious significance. Then we talk about situation. So the situation of a city is its role within the larger surrounding context, right? How it connects to other places. And a city's situation can and does change across time. So, for example, the city of Rome, when it gets its start, it's really a backwater. I mean, it starts out, it's a village. And then ultimately it becomes the center of the Roman Empire. And then later still, it becomes the center of the Roman Catholic Church, right? So the situation changes dramatically from being basically a nothing, right? Doesn't matter, to being really having probably the most influence of any city in the entire world at that point, with the possible exception of some of the Chinese cities. So, just a real quick map shows us the Roman Empire circa 117 CE, so at about the height of the empire. And as you can see, right, remember your geography, I'm sure you can find Italy, right? It's the lady's boot that's kicking the island of Sicily. You can see where it traces all the way through Spain and France, part of Germany, all the way into Eastern Europe, around the Black Sea, into Greece, into modern-day Turkey, parts of Arabia, all the way across into North Africa. And you can start to see, when you look at this map, right, where the walls, first of all, where they try to keep people out. You can actually still see some of these barriers. They were that well constructed. But then also, where are the trade routes? And as you'll notice, the important thing is, with a lot of these trade routes, is they're going through the water. Okay, or they're going along water, for instance, with Egypt and the Nile. But also they're going over land, and when you look at the land routes, a lot of those are roads, and Roman roads very well constructed, so you can actually still go travel on Roman roads if you go into parts of Europe, parts of southwestern Asia, and into North Africa. So, going back to Roman cities, they would talk a little bit about the layout, right, its form and structure. We call that urban morphology. As much as possible, Romans adopted Greek patterns. The Romans really idolized the Greek, and so amongst the many, many aspects of Greek culture they adopted was the way Greeks planned their colonial cities, which is that rectangular grid pattern, which if you've ever been in a well-designed city, you know works incredibly well for helping people locate things, for making streets easy to travel, right? And then they also adopt that idea of functional zonation, which again, if you listen to the other lecture, you know it talks about how different areas or segments of the city serve different purposes within the overall function of the city. So, for example, in Rome, the Forum is a lot like the Agora that we talked about with the Greek cities, right? And the Forum becomes this place that starts out primarily as business and ultimately morphs into a place where there's a lot of politicking that goes on. It kind of becomes the political center of Roman cities, and to some extent as well, the religious center of Roman cities. As emperors, for instance, in the city of Rome, start to build temples near or in the Forum as a way of showing their respect for their ancestors or for spouses and for the gods, things like that. So, after Greece and Rome, right, so the Roman Empire falls in, I think it's roughly 430 is the date that historians typically use. There are arguments surrounding that date, as there are many dates in history, but 430 is as good a date as any, right? Europe then falls into what we call kind of the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages for most of Europe. So during this time, urbanization, that process of building and developing cities, continues, especially outside of Europe. So Europe kind of falls apart, for lack of a better term, without the ties of Rome and the Roman Empire really holding things together in that strong center. But outside of Europe, you start to see the development of really large cities. So, for instance, in West Africa, there's a number of trading cities that get their start on the margins of the Sahara, for instance, Timbuktu. Right? In the Americas, you see huge urban growth, especially within the Mayan and the Aztec empires. Right? So, for instance, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which is the site of modern-day Mexico City, when the Spanish conquerors come in the early 1500s, they literally describe a city that is so beautiful and so gorgeous and so large and so vibrant that they've never seen anything like it before. It's significantly bigger than anything in Spain, certainly, and even bigger, really, than anything in Europe. That urbanization continues in China, for example. China really is kind of the center of world trade up until arguably really probably the 1600s, 1700s. And then it kind of begins this slow decline, right? So talking about early urban growth, we going to go ahead and summarize here and kind of wrap things up. We talked a little bit about Greece as being kind of a secondary hearth, which is really a way of saying that they didn't develop the city idea in Greece the way they did independently in a bunch of other places, but it's the Greek form that ultimately comes to dominate largely through the diffusion process of the Roman Empire, right? And one of the things that Rome did and did very well was they tried to create a certain uniformity throughout the empire as a way of tying things in together and a way of linking everybody and creating this common culture. And we talked a little bit about the specifics of Greek cities and the specifics of Roman cities. Again, stuff that it's kind of nice to know just to place things in their broader context. But it's not super important to know in terms of, am I going to find this on the AP exam? The answer to that is no. The information you might find, you might find some questions about urban morphology. You might very well find questions about site and situation, right? Particularly when we're talking about cities, but as well when we're talking about things like factories and things like that. Those are some of those concepts that we just keep coming across here in the course. So that's a definite bet that you might very well find a question or two about them. And then we ended really, we talked about what was going on outside of Europe. And one of those things to remember, by the way, during the Middle Ages in Europe is that urbanization doesn't continue. And as a matter of fact, what you see is a lot of de-urbanization as people are drifting away from the cities and out into the hinterlands because they need to be able to support themselves and support their families. And it's hard to do that in cities when there's a breakdown in transportation systems that are moving agricultural products around the empire. So if you have any questions about this stuff, I'd urge you to bring them into class, come in and see me, and ask them. And I guess I will see you the next time we meet.